And I was, to be honest, kind of stunned that one, that he thought that way, and two, that he put that in writing.
Welcome to Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the upcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science, now available for pre-order. I'm Joy Moore, here with my co-author, Kent Anderson, and today is Wednesday, November 12th, 2025. Hey, Kent,
Hey, Joy.
how's it going?
It is going. It is going. It is going. We are super busy right now. And we just had a great interview with Jeremy Berg, which
We
we're going to
sure
get to in just a second.
We sure did. He was fantastic. I really enjoyed hearing from him and learning about his experiences. And we came across the opportunity to talk to Jeremy because we read his compilation of his correspondence, um, his very respectful but pointed correspondence, persistent as well,
Mm-hmm.
with NIH Director Jay Bhattacharya. And
Yeah.
if you haven't read 50 Shades of Jay, I highly recommend it.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It is. It is a keeper. It's a page turner. But we talk about a lot of other things, diversity in science, and some great stories there. The importance of the NLM director position in scientific uh, discovery and the
hmm
role of libraries in general in that, and a whole bunch of other things. It's a fantastic interview. So, and it's a little on the longer side, so I'm going to try to keep this a little short, and we'll just get right to it, if that's okay with you.
That's okay with me.
Okay, here we go. So today we're talking with Jeremy Berg, a former editor of Science, former president of ASBMB, and former director of the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, NIGMS, at the NIH. Berg grew alarmed at the nomination of Jay Bhattacharya as director of the NIH and began a correspondence with him after his confirmation. Striking a calm, evidence-based tone, Berg often received no response from Bhattacharya, and when he did, the responses seemed to bristle with political overtones. Berg published these correspondences in late summer in PDF form under the title 50 Shades of Jay. We wanted to talk with Jeremy about this and given the recent spate of announcements about director-level hiring in the NIH, we wanted to discuss this as well. And then we'll also have our discoveries of the week. So welcome, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, glad to join you. Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, thank you so much. I came across the 50 Shades of Jay. I think it was like a Saturday morning, right, Ken? And I was
Yeah,
like, what is this? And it was a page turner.
absolutely.
So can you tell us about just give us a little bit of background about, what you've been doing, since you've left the public sphere, so to speak, and how you came across this project that you took on.
Well, so I was at NIGMS from 2003 to 2011, and then my wife was recruited to Pittsburgh, and I was the trailing spouse and got a good position here, and she did as well. She's a biomedical researcher, breast imager, MD, PhD radiologist, and so we've been in
Mm,
Pittsburgh for, I guess, 14 years now.
mm,
And um, I've been here other than taking 3.5 years as editor in chief of science, whereas that Ken mentioned. Um, when things started, I've kept tracking what was going on at NIH, so it was not really a big departure. But when things with the new administration in, not 10 months ago, things started going sideways at NIH pretty quickly. And one of the aspects of it was there was a communications freeze. So people inside NIH couldn't tell anybody what was going on and couldn't even learn what was going on internally very well. And a few of my former colleagues there started reaching out to me and sharing information, and I started sharing them on my Bluesky account, and sort of quickly became sort of a hub for information from inside NIH, and sharing concerns from the scientific community as well.
Hmm.
And that evolved from um, I think I had about 800 followers in on inauguration day, and I now have almost 25,000. So it's been become a
Wow.
become a a bigger operation. And the 50 Shades of Jay started off with, I originally started writing to him as completely good faith,
Mm-hmm.
trying to help, and I can share my context for that in a second.
Yeah.
And I kept them private, as that was my intent. And then actually, after he did an interview with Jocelyn Kaiser at Science, where the interview was cut short after 20 minutes and was clearly very contentious, I decided that, because Jocelyn is one of the most earnest, sort of painfully earnest reporters I've ever met,
Mm-hmm.
um, I decided that maybe I needed to share my correspondence with him, and started sharing them on Bluesky. And then somebody suggested, well, there are all these emails that you shared. They're hard to keep track of on Bluesky. Why don't you put them together? So I started trying to compile them into a PDF, and I wasn't even sure what to call them. And one of my friends suggested 50 Shades of Jay. And I was like, I sort of cringed and thought, well, it's too good. I sort of have to, but
Yeah.
anyway,
It's a good
so
cringe.
yeah.
Well, it's apt, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it didn't start off as shades. I mean, it was really, the original impetus was, when I started in 2003, unlike some people, I hadn't been inside NIH. A lot of people who become institute directors have spent time in the intramural program or spent time in other roles, and I was a newbie. I'd probably been on the NIH campus for literally 4 or 5 times before I started, parked and started getting ready to chair my first set of meetings. So
Wow.
um, it was a daunting learning curve. I mean, NIH is a complicated place, and there's so much jargon, and there's so many programs, and there's so many people and everything else. And probably I'm guessing maybe my second month. So NIGMS covers um, sort of basic fundamental research, cell biology, pharmacology, physiology, genetics, et cetera,
Hmm.
but also covers a few clinical areas that the authorization for NIGMS, which is from 1962, says NIGMS is responsible for areas that are of interest to two or more institutes, or areas that fall outside the area of any existing institute. So
Mm.
it was
Okay.
basically Congress's attempt to create a miscellaneous drawer, so they wouldn't have to
Mm-hmm.
constantly create new institutes every time something came up.
Got
And
it.
the clinical areas included burn and trauma research. So I've been learning
Mm.
about burn and trauma and wound healing and sepsis and the things that NIGMS was responsible for. And a couple of months in, there was a meeting on digital biology, which was the sort of computer people and biology people talking to each other. And this was when the genome project was just sort of coming to its first stage of fruition, and so on and
Right.
so forth. There was a lot of interest in this.
Yeah.
And on my way down to the meeting, somebody came up to me and introduced himself, and that said he was a member of the burn program. And I started talking about burn research and how much I was learning. And he was looking at me like I was, like I had three, you know,
Three
three
heads,
heads
huh?
or something like that. It was like, and I thought, well, that did not go well. And I wasn't sure what it was. So I went back up to my office and looked him up, and discovered that he was talking about BIRN, which is the Bioinformatics Research Network, which was an
Oh.
NIH program that I
It
didn't know
is
anything about.
complicated there.
And, I felt like I was sure he walked away thinking, what kind of a moron did they just hire here? So with that in mind, I realized, for Director Bhattacharya coming in and trying to learn not just one institute, but everything that was going on at NIH was just daunting.
Right,
Um,
right.
so the first time I wrote to him was when
Well, and you're also
um,
both Stanford alum, right?
we're both Stanford. Yeah, well, I mean, I was born and raised on the Stanford campus, and I thought
Okay.
my father was a math professor there, so I was there from age, 0 to 22 when I went off to graduate school, but he was there from an undergraduate, graduate school, medical school on the faculty. So he was, his pedigree was as strong as or stronger than mine.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right,
But
right.
we never interacted at all. And I actually, one of the troubling things I discovered when he was named as the potential NIH director is I reached out to a lot of friends and, former colleagues at Stanford and sort of said, what can you tell me about him? And people just didn't know who he was.
Mm.
And that struck me as kind of odd. I mean, he was,
Yeah, kind of a cipher. Mm.
well, he was much more buried in the sort of health economics world, even though he was in the
Right,
medical school. All the people in the, chairs in the medical school just had never interacted with him.
right. He never did anything clinical, right?
Well, he never did any clinical training, but he also clearly never interacted much with, a lot of groups there, which is just, that's fine. It
Unusual.
just was going to be a challenge for somebody to learn
Right.
what he needed to learn. So the first thing that came up was they started talking about, NIH started talking about a new project to look at causes of autism based on integrating databases of various sorts to try to look for patterns and so on that would suggest what
Mm.
caused autism. And that when I first heard about that, I thought, well, that's odd because I remembered in 2007, I was running the NIH Director's Pioneer Award program, and one of the applicants and eventual winners was a sociologist named Peter Behrman, who's at Columbia, whose project was integrating databases to look at the causes of autism.
Mm. Oh, wow.
Mm.
And
2007, huh?
and what he was doing was data from California and just collecting, getting data, access to data. And that was the biggest concern that people had with the project was whether he'd actually get access to all the data. But he
Right.
did that and was looking at literally, house by house data about where people were diagnosed with autism and trying to figure out what it was correlated or associated with.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
what he found was that there were clusters of autism diagnoses, particularly in parts of Southern California around LA. But his analysis was that it was basically social contagion, that it wasn't
Mm.
proximity to any, chemicals or anything else. It was that they were near other people whose children had been diagnosed with autism and near doctors who tended to diagnose people with autism. So it was
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
an interesting project. Anyway,
Yep.
I just thought he should know about this project, and there wasn't any agenda other than I would hate for you to not know that NIH actually had funded a fairly high profile study of this, you know, 18 years ago,
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
and that collecting data about social structure was also going to be important rather than just looking at environmental exposures and everything else that's being done. So
Mm-hmm.
he didn't write back. But then the next time I wrote to him was about, I was tracking how slow, how far behind NIH was getting in making grants because they, that the cadence of grant making is pretty uniform year to year, and because of
Right.
delays associated with pauses on federal grants and other things, NIH was getting further and further behind, and everybody was, on social media and so on was getting nervous about when would they be too far behind to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I did an analysis of that, just looking at how much money had NIH gotten out the door over a 1 month or 2 month or 3 or 4 or 5 month period, historically going back a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that at the time I wrote to him, where there were 5 months left in the fiscal year, there was basically no example where NIH had gotten that much money out the door, the amount of money they had left to get out the door
Right.
in a
Right.
5 month period. And I just wrote to him saying, you know, you should be aware of this. It was basically, if I were in your position, I would want somebody to tell me that we're getting far enough behind that we're really going to have to work hard to get caught up.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And I
and
think that's one thing that I definitely learned, and maybe other people don't appreciate the pace of spending the allocated funds is very important, and it's integral to the job of running the NIH. You've got to spend it. within a certain amount of time, right?
Right. So Congress appropriates money on an annual basis. So the fiscal year ends September 30th, and by law, agencies have to get all the money that Congress has allocated
Right. Use it or
committed
lose it, right?
by the end of, well, not only you use it or lose it, but also, I mean, this is still something that's become controversial. I never thought it was in the past, but
Mm,
you know, the founding fathers gave Congress the power of the purse, and
Mm-hmm.
they have the responsibility for allocating money. And the assumption has always been that the executive branch is obligated to spend the money that Congress appropriates.
right.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that now may well be litigated of whether or not that's true or not. But that was
Yeah.
certainly the understanding.
Yeah.
Um, so that was when I actually explicitly requested in my email, I'd like at least an acknowledgement of receipt of this email. And that's when he wrote back and said, you said that one of my primary responsibilities is getting the funds that Congress committed. I I have a slightly view of that. I think my responsibility is to make sure that the money is spent appropriately, and I'm not going to spend the money on ideological boondoggles and research that's going to risk another
Yeah.
pandemic. And I
Yeah.
was, to be honest, kind of stunned that one, that he thought that way, and two, that he put that in writing to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
um, so that changed my perception about what my challenge was. It wasn't just helping inform somebody who had a lot to learn, but it was helping inform somebody who had a lot to learn, but clearly had a pretty strong ideological or political filter about what they were learning.
Yeah. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's a stinginess to all of this administration's approaches, but also for him in particular, because of the Great Barrington Declaration and things like that, a real kind of obsession with COVID policies, and the pandemic seems to have been a place where either he made hay in a certain political sense, or made friends, or both, made allies, and so that group kind of has been swept into positions of power now, and they have brought with them an ideology and a flintiness about spending as well. So
Yeah, although I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, it is amazing to me how much um, I guess obsession is the right word about COVID policies and everything else sort of dominates a lot of thinking. I mean, COVID was obviously a big deal, but it is
mhm,
a teeny percentage of what NIH is about.
right,
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Director Bhattacharya feels very aggrieved about how he was treated after the Great Barrington Declaration, and feels that he wasn't given proper respect for what he thinks is getting a lot of things right. And that's a very arguable point about what they got right and what they got wrong.
mhm,
Mm-hmm.
I think the flintiness about spending has a little bit to do with that, but I think that has more to do with the fact that the administration is trying to get universities under control from their perspective, and
right,
that it has nothing to do with biomedical research funding or COVID or anything else. It has to do with the fact that there's $45 billion a year that go, or $36 billion a year that go out to universities, and that is just a huge amount of leverage
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
to, to withdraw funds or threaten to withdraw funds to get universities to capitulate to various other political demands about things that have nothing to do with biomedical research.
yeah. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's well known that these people view everything as transactional, and so when they have a chance to work a transaction, they'll work it. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about, so environmental health is a big issue for these people. There's a lot of, focus on environmental health. And one of the things that happened recently is that the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences had a personnel change relatively rapidly, right? So one of the head of the agency who oversaw a couple of very questionable studies, one about whether your cell phone bakes your brain when you're talking on the phone, and it was never published, but created an urban legend about that for more than a hot minute.
Right.
And then another one about low IQ and fluoride that RFK grasped and said the more fluoride you get, the dumber you get, or stupider you get, or something like that. I don't know. I don't pay
Yeah.
attention to him because I'm too stupid, I guess. But in any event,
Must be the fluoride.
the head
That
of that
must be the floor.
agency, it must be, it's all the fluoride.
Yeah.
You got
Um,
great teeth, Kent, but that's all.
but the head of the agency who oversaw those studies and more just moved into a more central role in the MAHA group. And one of J.D. Vance's closest friends was quickly named to replace him. That is not normal hiring procedure. And now you have all of these positions that were just opened up in relatively short order. 6 director level roles, 8 high level positions in all to be filled by November 21st. What do you think's going on there? Is it as bad as I'm suspecting it might be?
I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but it's certainly, as close to if you ask me sort of what were my worst case scenarios, this is pretty close to the top of the list.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the environmental health sciences position was utterly caught me off guard because that wasn't a vacant position, and the person who was there was just reappointed 4 months ago, 5 months
Mm,
ago, something like
mm-hmm.
that.
Oh, wow.
So the institute directors are on a 5-year renewal cycle, and his
Okay.
position had come up. The first person whose position who came up was Eric Green, who was the director of the Human Genome Research Institute,
Mm-hmm.
and his position wasn't renewed, so he was basically, you know, administratively retired
Right. Right.
unexpectedly, and apparently against the wishes of, or claims that against the wishes of Director Bhattacharya and others at NIH, that they wanted to
Mm,
keep him, but somebody said nope, nope, nope.
yeah.
Um, and then Rick Wojcik, was the current NIEHS director, was the next person whose contract was up for renewal. So everybody was watching that, and there was a bit of a battle, and he was on leave for a couple weeks as things were getting sorted out. But then he was reappointed,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody sort of relaxed about that. And then I got news from somebody I didn't know at Duke saying there's a guy here who's going around saying he's about to be appointed director of NIEHS, and he's an associate professor who doesn't really do environmental health sciences work, and
Mm,
his
But he
main
happens to live in Durham.
he lives in North Carolina,
Right.
yeah, because at
mm-hmm.
Duke, and his biggest claim is that he's one of JD Vance's best friends. And
Yeah.
I went, I hope that's not right. I hope that's not right. That's not right. But the person sounded pretty confident. And then 2 days later, the
There
announcement came
was.
out that that was happening. And he's an associate professor who seems entirely okay, but nothing special.
Mm-hmm.
And the lack of process, was really troubling to me.
Yeah.
Um, And then the question is this just a one-off thing where somebody wanted to do a favor to the vice president, or is this something further than that? And when I saw the 6 institute director positions posted last week, and the rumor is that there are a total of 13 that are currently vacant. The
Wow.
rumor is that the other 7 are going to be posted this week.
Okay.
But I don't know that. That's just what the scuttlebutt is.
Right.
And this is such a deviation from any normal process, for any sort of hiring at this level position, let alone institute directors. I mean, I went through the process both as a candidate and then serving on several search committees when I was at
I was
NIH.
going to ask you about that. How did you get the job? What what
Well,
what
so yeah.
what was that like?
So, first off, it was very much a search process. If you asked me list the 500 things on your career path that you'd consider, being an NIH Institute director probably wouldn't have been on the list. If it was, it would have been, 475th after getting back in shape and trying to make the major leagues as a pitcher, which was true when I was 14 or 15. Um, but I got a phone call from somebody on the search committee saying, my name had come up as somebody who might have the skill set and interest in doing this, and, sent me a link to the position description. And I had been involved in a few national policy issues around postdoctoral offices and so on. So I made some connections with people at NIH, but mostly I was a practicing scientist and a department chairman, and a little bit of interest in science policy, but nothing, no particularly deep involvement with NIH. And I was like, why would I want to do this? And then I looked at it and said, well, NIGMS had funded my research from when I was actually even an undergraduate and a graduate student and all through my independent career. So I knew the institute from that perspective. I'd been on a study section and been chair of a study section, so I knew the review process sort of
Mm-hmm.
coupled to NIGMS. So it was one of those things like, well, this is not anything I imagined, but maybe I should think about it. And
But
then,
was it kind of a civic duty?
well, so they pulled out the big gun on the second day. So after I clearly said I'll take a look, but I think my response was like, I'm not really serious about this, but I'm not going to say no.
Mm-hmm.
I got a phone call from Ruth Kirstein, who was a 5 foot tall giant at NIH. I mean, she had been the longtime director of NIGMS and
You
was
don't
kind
mess
of,
around with anyone named Ruth, I've learned.
well, she was somebody I'd interacted with on these postdoctoral issues, and she was just a force to be reckoned with. She was
Mm,
incredibly knowledgeable, had more integrity than any person I'd ever met. I mean, she was just, I mean, I knew her better after that, but I mean, she was just, um, and she called me up and said, you'd be good at this, you should apply.
mm.
And, I said, yes, Ruth, I'll get right on it. And I think my application was in by 5 o'clock that day. And I'll come back to a story. I actually had a weird connection with Ruth that I didn't know about, but they eventually named all the training awards after her. She sort of built the training programs at NIH and
Oh, that's
a
fantastic.
lot of the diversity programs, and she was acting director of NIH twice, when they were between directors, and she was the conscious and the soul and the sort of go-to person when you wanted somebody who everybody respected, who would do a good
Hmm.
job with an unbelievable work ethic and everything else. So
Hmm.
it was it was very unfair recruiting tactics because after that I just didn't have a choice but
Right.
applying. And then I went through phone interviews and 2 rounds of in-person interviews on the NIH campus, and there was a search committee that was half NIH high level, institute directors and similar sort of staff, and outside scientists, who were some of my scientific heroes and so on. So it was a very serious process, and the interviews were serious. They
Mm-hmm.
asked a lot of questions of, sort of all over the place from, which I still remember. I mean, I remember the
Right.
questions of,
Yeah,
sort of,
those scenes don't leave your mind. Yeah.
so, so if this situation come up, how would you handle it? I mean, it was very much, how would you think on the fly of which was the right questions to be asking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then it disappeared for a while. And then after a few weeks, I got a call from, you know, would you be interested? Do you have time to speak to the NIH directors? Like, yeah, I think I can squeeze him in. Um, and, got the formal offer, although the offer actually comes from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So
Right.
that was my experience then. And then I was on 2 search committees when I was inside, and they were exactly the same thing from the other side of the table of,
Right.
beating the bushes and trying to make sure we had the best pool of candidates we could possibly get, including a
Right.
bunch of people who clearly weren't interested, but were persuadable,
Yeah.
and
Right.
just trying to
Right.
get people in the room to have the conversations with them.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Um,
compared to that kind of normal, rigorous search committee process, I think we've seen, for NIH, and we've all experienced in our careers in other settings too, having these postings just appear out of the thin air and on such, it looks like the kind that, you put up as a hiring manager just to meet some sort of paperwork requirement, but
yeah,
you already
Yeah.
have the job filled.
yeah. No,
So,
when I was my first faculty position was in the chemistry department at Johns Hopkins, and it had a very bad case of what I call chemistry department disease, where the organic chemist and the physical chemist didn't respect each other and were constantly fighting for control of the department. And
Mhm.
mm,
there was an open position, and the physical chemist wanted to hire somebody in particular, and they literally posted an ad which said, wanted chemical physicist who's also an observational astronomer. And it was like, well, that doesn't read like they're thinking of a particular person now, does it? It's like, what the heck? So I'd
his
seen
name has
that
to be Steve.
right. No, well, it was actually a woman, but yeah, no,
Okay.
exactly. So it was just, that was embarrassing. And,
Mhm.
that was for an assistant professor, not for, an institute director responsible for billions of dollars worth of taxpayer money. And, my job as NIGMS director was the best job over my career. I mean, I've had a wonderful, rich
Mm,
career, but
yes.
it was the job that I loved. I mean, it
What was
was,
your favorite part about it?
um, probably the part I liked the best was communications, but the best thing
Mm,
about it was just so much to do. And I mean, it was um, exhausting, and I was just um, having to learn about all kinds of different things and really dig into really important things. It was kind of very much the good news was that the levers of power were sort of in the back of your office that you could fiddle with when you wanted to.
mhm,
Hmm.
The bad part of that was you realized how much responsibility that you had, that you could pull the lever, and if you weren't thoughtful about it, you could make a whole bunch of people's lives really miserable for no particular good purpose.
mm,
Hmm.
So that was daunting but fun and satisfying. And then the communications piece, since I'd come in from outside and didn't really know how NIH worked very well, as I learned that it was actually a very um, thoughtful, a lot of the processes were actually very thoughtful and people were very much concerned about getting it right and so on. I started sharing, so here's a new policy and here's how we got there. I
mm,
Hmm.
started first off an electronic newsletter and then started a blog that was just, here's something, we want your input, and seriously saying we really do want your input, or here's what we're doing, and here's all the analysis to back it up, and here's why we're doing what we're doing. And I found that um, satisfying as a discipline about making sure you can, you're comfortable explaining what you're doing to other people. It's a good way to make sure you're not screwing it up.
right,
But also
right.
getting good ideas from the scientific community and getting the goodwill. I mean, they felt ownership of NIGMS policies. So even if they thought it was a terrible idea, they at least realized that we had listened to them seriously and
Hmm.
tried to get it right. Even if they think we
Hmm.
got it wrong, they at least weren't sort of bitter that we didn't even think about their perspective. So
Right,
that
right.
was that was that was definitely my favorite part in the end.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned when you were talking about Ruth that she was the head of the diversity efforts, and
Well,
and
she founded them. So she early
okay.
on in her time as an IGMS director, um, some people from the African American community came to NIH and said, we have a problem because there are all these talented young people, particularly Black people,
Hmm.
who are limited because their only educational options are really HBCUs. There wasn't, at that point, there wasn't much pathway to get into more research intensive institutions as undergraduates and so on. And um, that turned into a partnership between Ruth and other people, and then Edward Brooke, who was a senator, a Republican senator from Massachusetts, who
Mm,
sort of pushed through and built a lot of programs that were intended to really provide pathways to get young, Black scientists into ways where they could learn about doing science. And but some of them would get interested in research careers and then would become more and more competitive for getting faculty positions and eventually competing for NIH funding. So it was sort of a long-term program at trying to basically capture the talent of these people who were just didn't have the opportunities because of other aspects of our society that had
Right.
been there historically. And
Right.
just to show you Ruth's approach, I mean, when she first started to do this, I think there were two other NIGMS staff members who were tasked with trying to set this up, and she sent them to Atlanta to live in the ghettos in Atlanta for 2 months
Hmm.
Hmm.
to learn what they were talking about, that
Yeah.
just so they would really have an appreciation for what people's lives were really like in these circumstances, so they'd start to shape programs in a way that would address the real issues and try to make a difference. And those programs, this was in the 1970s, and those programs existed through my time at NIH and continued, into the present. And those were one of the things that were under very direct assault this year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very precisely, almost surgically on the first days of the administration.
Well, I think there is a misunderstanding, whether it's intentional or otherwise, that there are forces within the administration and within the think tank community and so
The
on that,
Project 2025,
yeah, the Heritage Foundation and so
whatever.
on. And
Yeah.
these were, I interacted with these folks a lot when I was GMS director, not always pleasantly, but I did.
Mhm.
And they saw these programs as affirmative action and racial preference, and basically taking unqualified Black people and saying, here's your chance to get funding and to get all this special treatment,
Right.
without any, thinking it was kind of a social justice thing, that we're just
Mhm.
trying to give people a break to get something that they didn't
Right. It's the
deserve.
welfare queen thinking,
Yeah,
right? It's
exactly.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
the reality was that was never what the programs were about. And the way they were implemented, particularly by the time I left NIH, was the definition of diversity was broadened very much past what it was initially, to
Hmm.
basically say any group that's historically underrepresented in biomedical research, be it racial or ethnic or any other dimension that one could articulate, NIH had an interest in trying to get them opportunities to be involved in biomedical research.
Mhm.
And that's what the programs that were all subject to grant terminations, and all the DEI programs. I
Mhm.
mean, the administration uses the term DEI, and Bhattacharya uses the term DEI without ever defining it.
Hmm.
It's just sort
Right.
of a boogeyman DEI bad thing,
Yeah.
Mhm.
without, and the Judge Young in Massachusetts, when he ruled that the grant terminations were illegal, went off on actually during the trial said, so you refuse to define what DEI is. I mean, he asked repeatedly for the Justice Department lawyers to define it, and they just wouldn't. And he said, well, since you won't define it, all I can assume is that you're opposed to DEI, and the words are diversity, equity, and inclusion. And therefore, the only reasonable conclusion is that you're for homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion.
Right.
Right.
and and was like, is that really your position? And they sort of
Yeah.
said, whatever, Your Honor. Um,
Right. Right.
so I was very concerned when this started happening
Hmm.
I mean, on the one hand, it was surgical. On the other hand, it was,
Yeah.
it was surgical, but with a chainsaw. I mean, they
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
targeted
Yeah.
very, very explicitly, but they went in and just started mowing
Hacking.
things down.
Yeah.
And so one program that I knew about is a so-called Mosaic program, which is a program for postdocs to sort of transition them into faculty positions. And that there are other programs of the same basic mechanism, but the Mosaic program was intentionally designed to try to reach out to individuals who had an interest in the sort of makeup of the biomedical workforce and so on. But the eligibility requirements were basically just to be interested in doing some work to help further, building the biomedical workforce.
Mm-hmm.
There were no requirement for any racial or ethnic or, even any other sort of dimension of diversity. And
Right.
there are about 200 of Mosaic fellows, and they are diverse in every sense of the word. I mean, there's some blacks and some Hispanics and some people with disabilities and some white guys who grew up in, Appalachia or in places where they had, they didn't have any science class, good science classes at their high
Right.
school, and they had to take a bus to get to the library to use the internet. And they managed to get from there into college and into a PhD and done really well and competed through this really incredibly competitive program with, where the success rate's 20% or less to get funding. And all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden their grant was terminated because they were a diversity hire. And they were like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
And I was like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
And so
That's
I
just
started
cruel.
I started pushing back against that. And again, I wrote to Director Bhattacharya saying, are you aware of what this program is? Because your vision for it, which is a bunch of unqualified black kids who are being given some special treatment, is just not at all related to reality. And
Right.
perhaps you should learn about it before you go along with this nonsense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And is this the ideological boondoggle you're talking about? Because that's not
Right.
what this is.
And
Yeah,
he
you're.
never replied to that, did he?
He did not.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And have you written to him since you published the 50 Shades of Jay?
Yeah, no, I've been adding to it. I,
Oh,
you know,
good.
Okay.
I there. I mean, I've updated it about 3 or 4 times, and I've got a few more that have been recent correspondences that
Okay. Are you
Mhm.
putting version numbers on it so we can keep track?
I will. That's a good idea. I will do that. I will.
Yeah.
I
It's the
will.
old publisher in me coming out.
Yeah, I will. I will. Version control is important. I'm now a computational biologist, at least in
There you
principle. So
go. There you
so I
go.
should be doing that. But yeah, no, I will. I
And
will
Yeah.
certainly do.
what has the reaction been for the people who've read it? Are you getting a lot of feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything in it had already been published online on Bluesky anyway, so a lot of people have
Mhm.
have seen them anyway. But I think people, like yourselves, who discovered it as the book
Yeah.
version,
Right.
have commented on it as, sort of an important documentation of history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I'm I don't know whether it has any influence him or not. I don't know where he reads my emails anymore. I'm not even sure he gets my emails anymore, or whether they've
Right.
put a
Get
filter in to
screened
make
out.
sure that they don't doesn't get to see them.
Right.
Um, but my attitude is, if you don't try, you know the answer. So
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
try and see what happens. And I've also, um, it got shadier at some point. Well, one of the other things I sent him early on, there was a remarkable scientist that I interacted with when I was at NIH, who was another person from Stanford named Ben Barris. I don't know if you know the Ben story, but
Hmm.
so Ben was um, an absolutely first-rate MD PhD neuroscientist who was one of the pioneers in discovering that glial cells, which are sort of the non-neurons in the brain, are actually incredibly important for all sorts of things.
Hmm.
And when I first started at NIH, there was a program, the NIH Director's Pioneer Program, and the first year, this was for sort of high-profile scientists who were sort of not in the normal mold of NIH grantees. And the first year, there were 9 awards made, and there were 9 male awards made to men. And it was also, about half of them were people who were already pretty well ensconced in the NIH system, and I was very disappointed that it was kind of a lost opportunity and a really
Hmm.
bad message to send of nine no no diversity at all in the winners.
Right.
So I was complaining that I thought this was a lost opportunity to the deputy director, who said, oh, the NIH director really needs to hear about this. So I dutifully went back to my office and wrote a 2 or 3 page email with all my concerns, and then 2 days later walked into a meeting and was asked if I wanted to run the program. And I should have realized that the deputy director was telling me to go back to my office and fill in my job application for the position.
That's right.
Um,
Raise your hand.
so Ben was very outspoken, particularly about the women issue, saying, this was, clear there are all these talented women who had clearly hadn't been considered very seriously, and it was a terrible message to send, and NIH has to do better than this. And there were a lot of people complaining Ben was the most persistent and the most thoughtful. And so that program is unusual in that it at the end of it, the top 20, 25 candidates come for interviews. So there's a committee that interviews the top candidates of it, the committee of outside scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, Ben would be a great person to have on this committee. He's a, really first-rate scientist. He clearly is passionate about science and, lots of different things. And it's probably better to have him inside helping us fix the problems rather than outside complaining about it.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
So invited him and he agreed. And about 4 days before the interview meeting, I was telling the director of the Neurology Institute that Ben had agreed to chair the committee. And she said very offhandedly, "Oh, Ben's great. He'll do a great job. You do know that Ben used to be barber, right?" And I was like, no, go on. And so I told the NIH director so he didn't get blindsided by that. And Ben's history was amazing. So he
Mm.
had been an MD neurologist who fell in love with research and realized that the progress was going to be made by understanding things better, got his
Mm-hmm.
PhD, got a position at Stanford, got tenure at Stanford, just, well, had got breast cancer,
Mm-hmm.
had a double mastectomy, and thought, well, that's an improvement. I've been never wanted, I felt like I was a boy since I was two.
Hmm.
So, I'm perfectly glad to be rid of those ridiculous things.
Right.
Mm.
Um, and didn't know anything about the existence of transgender people. And he
Okay.
discovered that this was a thing and he wasn't, a freak. It was a real phenomenon that had lots of people who had the same feelings that he had, that he just wasn't
Right.
wasn't
There was a
allowed to
path.
live the way he wanted, that he felt like was a person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so after Barbara got tenure at Stanford, he transitioned to Ben
Hmm.
and is one of the few people I know in the world who basically has a control experiment, a control
Mm-hmm.
arm. So he was a scientist who'd been a woman in science and then was a man in science.
Mm-hmm.
And the first talk he gave as Ben, two scientists after his talk were overheard, one saying to the other, his work is so much better than his sister's.
Oh my.
No.
And it's like, so where do you file that? Is that a criticism? Is it a compliment? It just feels really awful.
Says more about them than anything.
And I asked him,
Wow.
when we were at the meeting, I asked him what the biggest difference was. And he said, I get to complete my sentences at scientific meetings now. And, and I, and I felt, oh, that's it. That can't be true. And then I thought, oh boy, do I feel seen. This is very uncomfortable. I'm going to have to be very mindful of my behavior at scientific meetings now as I interact
Yeah,
with him.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's
So,
amazing.
the sad part is the breast cancer was probably caused, he had a BRCA2 mutation. And he ended up
Mm-hmm.
dying of pancreatic cancer,
Mm.
which he got later and died in his early 60s. But with the encouragement of Nancy Hopkins, who was a, woman at MIT, who was the person who sort of led the effort to try to get lab space equity and other sorts of things for women faculty at MIT, who knew him from the Barbara days. He
Mm.
wrote an autobiography, which was
Mm.
published posthumously, called Autobiography of a Transgender Scientist, which both has his science, but also a lot of his career path stories and so on. And
Mm.
it is a wonderful book. And, Ben was he was an amazing, courageous person who just wouldn't put up with people behaving badly. And he would fight any fight. And he was incredibly incredibly committed to his trainees. He was elected to the National Academy. He was a really top-rate
Hmm.
scientist.
Yeah.
And the
Wow.
beginning in
What
the
a
forward to
story.
the forward to the book, which just, will still, I'll probably start crying here, but the
Mm.
end of it is his last 4 days when he was in hospice dying of pancreatic cancer. He spent his time updating all his letters of recommendation for his trainees because he didn't want them to be disadvantaged by his death. And it's just,
Wow.
I mean, that was Ben.
Wow.
What a
There's a
commitment to
there's
the
a
students. Mm.
there's an award-winning filmmaker who's working on a movie version
Oh,
about Ben,
great.
That's good.
which hopefully will get she's essentially done with the screenplay now. It's called
Hmm.
Ask
Good.
the Question. So
Mm.
it's a
Mm.
really important project, I think, not just about transgender people, but about women in science and about people and everything else. So
Yeah.
anyway, I sent Bhattacharya a copy of that book saying you should read this. Um,
Yes. And
and
that was near the end, I think, of
The latest compilation.
yeah.
No, that was fairly early on. Anyway,
Oh,
I
okay.
never got a
Uh-huh.
response from him, although I did get a response from the executive secretariat thanking me
Oh,
for
yeah,
the
yeah.
book, although
That's right. Yeah.
they got it wrong that he wasn't a classmate of Bhattacharya's at Stanford. He was
Yeah, that's right.
a faculty colleague. But
Right. Right.
so I've done that. I you know Director Bhattacharya does a lot of podcasting, particularly with sort of right-leaning
Hmm.
places, and
Yeah, the bros are really into him, and he's
so I
Mm.
I was in something had come up, and I was just in a, a particularly shady, trolly mood. So
Mm.
I sent him a Halloween costume of a scientist, saying, since you seem to be playing a scientist on podcasts, I thought you'd find this costume, maybe potentially find this costume useful. And might even make
Got
you
to
think
tweak
more
him a
like a
little.
make you behave more like a scientist in your day job. But I think that's probably the snarkiest thing I've done. But
That's pretty awesome. I like it.
good for you. Your
Yeah.
patience in the correspondence was admirable, but I also appreciated the plot evolution of your tone becoming more exasperated, yet still polite, but still
yeah,
give me a
I
break.
try to stick with the most sort of. I mean, I'm a data person fundamentally. It's mostly just
Yeah.
you should know about this stuff. But occasionally, I think I closed one of after he'd done something that was particularly offensive. I thought I think my closing was, rather than my usually sincerely yours, was with as much respect as I can muster. So
I want
That's
to
awesome.
since we've got you here, I want to take one of the open positions that's been posted is Director of National Library of Medicine. And so Kent and I are coming from the publishing side
yeah,
of things, both for commercial publishers, but mostly society,
right,
nonprofit publishers. And a lot of the work that we do is looking at what's going on in the scientific publication space, and particularly the flood of new journals, and in particular, new papers that are new types of papers coming from different publications that are getting indexed in PubMed, as well as in PubMed Central. Um, and the percentage of papers that are coming from here and far, near and far, but a lot of commercial kind of pay to play and predatory publishers have been indexed in PubMed, um, whereas so the percentage of society, community-based membership organizations, the ones that we kind of grew up with as these are the
right.
go-to places for this subject area, and we understand the hierarchy of you publish here or there, depending on how the specificity and the discipline. Um, it's a hot mess right now. And I'm curious if you have any sense of kind of what a new NLM director would be even tasked with at this point.
Um, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think publishing was a hot mess, when I was at Science, I think with, my, again, I sort of went into that position relatively naive about publishing, the business side of publishing. And, I sort of bought into the open access good view of publishing and discovered open access good, especially as a revenue model.
Yeah.
Um, and so I became much more skeptical, I guess. And the big publishers are, the best of them are pretty awful. I mean, the big players are, their profit margins are huge, and their interest in the scientific community is pretty limited. I think it's fair to
Mm-hmm.
say.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that was before the growth in really predatory journals and now AI and all these sorts of questions. So it's a hugely important position for all sorts of reasons. I mean, NLM is sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of NIH, and that's, it just doesn't get any respect. But if you ask what has changed the scientific landscape more than anything else, I think, not just pound for pound, but I think overall NLM has to be right up there. I mean, we're so used to,
Well, when we think about this, the scholarly record is something that we refer
right.
to as this is the, Rosetta Stone. This is, if
Yeah.
it's in the scholarly record, it's ratified and it should be used for this, that, and the other.
You can build
And
on it, right?
you
Yeah.
can build on it, you can trust it. And being in Index Medicus or Medline or PubMed
Yeah.
is has been at the heart of that for the international biomedical community. And so there's this
Yeah.
responsibility that comes with choosing what to index.
Well, I mean,
And
NLM
is
does
that
have,
something that we should continue to
NLM does
trust?
have processes for that, which are pretty, which can be pretty rigorous. And then, I know my wife, there's a Journal of Breast Imaging, which is a society-based journal that's really pretty good. And
Mm-hmm.
they struggled to get indexed because it's a relatively narrow field. And, there are just a lot of metrics like not having too many papers contributed by the editorial board and things like that. Just took them a while to get over. Um, I think those are real big questions. I think one of the things which I've been struggling with is the scientific community has depended so much on this is peer reviewed, as a sort of badge of approval.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that peer review, there's good peer review and there's bad peer review and
Mm-hmm.
there's peer review and name only peer review,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
they're all
Drive-by
peer
peer review.
reviewed.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I was at Science, there was a partnership with some organization that was sort of ranking, badging peer review based on how many peer reviewers they had per paper and things like that, which is a way to go, but doesn't really get at the question of, you know, is it serious or not? If you
Right.
submit a paper that's complete garbage, is it going to make it through peer review or not? I mean, that's really the question you want. I mean, if you submit an AI generated paper about, you know, something completely absurd,
Right.
will
Mm-hmm.
it get published or not?
Right.
And the answer for a lot of journals is, yeah, if they pay the APCs, they're in, and that's not great. So I wonder if there needs to be some other sort of certification process built
Mm-hmm.
to sort of say
Mm.
this is a journal that meets some internationally agreed upon, relatively ungameable standards of being a serious attempt to put things in the scholarly record that's likely
Mm-hmm.
to be real.
Yeah.
Um, so great challenge. I mean, all the AI issues for National Library of Medicine are huge. The database issues are always big questions. I think, again,
Mm-hmm.
if you ask the scientific community, you know, how much respect do you have for library science and librarians and so on, their response is, whatever. And then
Mm-hmm.
if you look at what has actually changed their ability to do science. It's
Right.
right up there. I mean, I was the same way. I'm a chemist
Right.
by training, and I used to really look down on analytical chemistry as kind of being the sort of blue collar, boring chemistry. And it's like, then I became a professional, I'm an inorganic chemist, but a synthetic inorganic chemist by training. And I sort of asked, so what do I do? Well, I spend most of my time trying to figure out what I made and how much of it I have. And it's like, that sounds an awful lot like analytical chemistry. So,
Backed right into it.
yeah.
So you said that there was a connection with Ruth that you
Oh,
were going to
yeah.
share. Is that your discovery of the week? I don't want to tread on that.
No, no, no. It's just, I can skip it, but basically, Um, so my father was named Paul Berg, and
Okay.
my life has been hopelessly complicated by the Paul Berg biochemist at
Hmm.
Stanford. So same name, same age, both at Stanford.
Mhm.
They're, they were, he had the other Paul Berg has a son named John who's my age. We went to school together. You know, when my parents were getting divorced, my mom's lawyer called the wrong Paul Berg and asked him if he was ready to sign the papers. I mean, it was a hot mess. So I was very used to sort of people saying, "Oh, your father is Paul Berg," and then just sort of assuming, and especially after he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry my first year in graduate school.
Oh boy.
And so when I think the first or second time I met Ruth when I was at NIH, she said, "I figured out who you must be, or who your parents must be." And I said, I was ready with my speech about two Paul Bergs at Stanford and whatever else. And she said, "Your parents must be Paul Berg and Judith Nadell." And I said, "That's correct. How do you know that?" And she said, "Your mom went to medical school with my husband, and we were actually their best friends in during those days."
Oh wow.
And then she thought for a second and she said, "In fact, we borrowed your parents' apartment for our honeymoon." And it was like, please stop, please stop. My therapy bills are already high enough. I don't need.
Oh,
Um,
that's amazing. That's
so
amazing.
it was a funny connection, and I think it
I
was
love small world stories.
well, I mean, it's small worlds, but it's small worlds that sort of constructed around, I
Right.
mean,
Already intersected in a lot of ways. Yeah.
a lot of the pretext for what's going on in universities is anti-Semitism,
Hmm.
and the reason that my parents and Ruth and Al got to be friendly is they were both
Hmm.
Jewish couples when there was a 3% quota on the number of Jewish students who could go to medical schools. They were sort of
Hmm.
naturally drawn to each other. So
Right. Right.
I
That
wish I'd
makes a
known
lot of
that story
sense.
before my parents had passed away because I was like, if I could go back in time, the first thing I would
Oh,
do is ask, tell me these stories. So
that's amazing.
But how
That's
cool that
amazing.
she knew who you are because of your mom.
yeah, no, it was I mean, I'm sure she put the pieces together and I'm think she looked I mean, I looked a lot like my dad and I think she sort of said, yeah, this has to be right. So
That's amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much. And now let's move on to do our discoveries of the week. All right. I'm going to let you, Jeremy, as the guest, you get to start out. So, do you have a discovery this week?
well, so it's been an ongoing discovery, but it's moving to a new phase this week. Actually has a lot to do with publishing and science and everything else. So
Mm.
Mm.
um, so
We're
my
all here. We're here for it.
I was I was a graduate student in the chemistry department at Harvard, and my PhD thesis was on synthesizing compounds that were supposed to mimic the reactivity of molybdenum-containing enzymes.
Mm.
And I ended up designing and synthesizing and characterizing a system that was not only reproduced the structures of what was known at that point about the active site of the enzymes, but also reproduced the reactivity that would carry out some of the same reactions. So it was a fairly big deal. Got attention, got me a PhD, various things. But the weak link in my thesis was the key product could either have been A or B, and I could never get sort of definitive proof which it was. I was trying to get crystals that I could actually solve the structure and be sure what it was. But
Hmm.
there was a lot of circumstantial evidence favoring A, and I did other experiments which convinced me that it was really A, but it was never nailed down as well as I would have liked. Um, And then as a postdoc, I moved in a completely different direction, was working on DNA binding proteins, and then zinc containing DNA binding proteins were discovered. So I had the perfect blend between my inorganic chemistry roots and the DNA binding protein world. And so I completely shifted direction and just, never went back. Didn't go to the meetings about molybdenum containing enzymes anymore, and didn't follow the field at all. And then I was actually working on I've been doing a series of things on, but before this administration, on Bluesky, sort of about my mentors and sort of stories of, I've had this really rich scientific experience. So I was writing one about my PhD advisor, including stuff about my thesis, and I wanted to post a figure from one of my papers. And because my filing system on my computer is pretty crummy, I couldn't find it. So I said, I'll just go to the Journal of the American Chemical Society website and find my paper. So I searched for Berg and Holm, and I discovered a paper that was published um, years after many years after my thesis was published, entitled "New Insights into the Berg-Holm Oxomolybdenum Enzyme Model."
Hmm.
And I thought, cool, somebody
Yeah.
somebody was working on my, still paying attention to my thesis work, a decade after I did it. And
Right.
so, I downloaded the paper and I started reading it, and I got about halfway through the abstract and discovered that their new insight was that they'd gotten crystals of the compound that I could never
Oh, wow.
dissolve crystals of. And it was B. It wasn't A.
Oh,
It was
wow.
B. That's
And
nice.
the problem with that was it meant that the data from my thesis was all fine. The interpretation was all wrong. And I was like, well, this is odd. And then I thought, the first thing I thought about was, I talked to my PhD advisor passed away a few years ago, but probably talked to him 20 times in the intervening time between that paper was published and when he passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And he never mentioned it. And I just never saw it because I just had changed fields.
Right.
And I thought that was weird. And then I remembered, he was a very kind of private, somewhat awkward person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he just thought I must know about it. And if I
Right.
wanted to bring it up, it was up to me. So he didn't bring it up. So I just never learned about it.
Wow.
So this was over Christmas. So I was, trying to get ready for family arriving and everything else. But I was like, I don't understand how to interpret all the data in my thesis. And I was just thinking and thinking and thinking, and then woke up in the middle of the night and was like, oh my God, I know what's going on. And had a completely different explanation for everything. And there was a lot of data, both what I collected, and then there were 3 or 4 postdocs and graduate students who'd worked on it afterwards. And I went and got all the data and digitized it all, and then built a model for kinetics, which is basically what the issue was with this new
Mm-hmm.
idea.
Hmm.
And everything fits, and it is
Oh, nice.
absolutely right, I'm
That's
sure.
awesome. That's
Um,
amazing.
so then I thought I really should publish this, sort of reinterpreting my thesis, and the conclusion is actually kind of, in some senses, more interesting about the enzymes than what I had done.
Right.
Um, so I submitted the paper to the original journal, and they said, this is not of general interest enough anymore. And it's kind of awkward because it's like, so, this is exactly how science should work, where you go back and you correct things. The
Right.
only problem was that there was a 14-year lag when I just didn't read the literature.
Yeah. The world has
So that
moved
was
on.
a little awkward. Um, but I submitted to another journal, and so the news this week is it's in its final stage of review, and I think it's going to be accepted. So I'm going
Oh,
to get that
fantastic.
published, and then I'm going to have fun because I'm going to write to the original journal and say, would you publish a note or a correction saying the interpretation of this paper, of this, including the title, is wrong, and
Right.
here's an alternative explanation which I think is right, so people don't
Right.
get misled by it. And I have no idea how that's going to go.
Yeah.
I'm also
Based
going to
on.
send a note to the department chair at Harvard saying, can I put a one-page thing in my thesis in the library saying, never mind, here's the right answer.
That's amazing. That's amazing. That's
That's the
that's very
perfect,
satisfying.
and then that's the perfect story of how the scientific record works, right? It takes time, things
It's
change,
slow. Yeah.
and
It can be
and
puzzles that aren't solved for a long time, and they're just
yeah.
presented.
But
Hmm.
I think the issue of how you tag papers that are, it's where the interpretation is just wrong. Obviously there are
Yeah.
attractions and so on, but just where the interpretation is wrong, either because of new data or something else. In principle, I think it's something that journals should be able to
Hmm.
develop, of just
Hmm.
a process that says, somebody has submitted a credible explanation that something about this, just, you know, a
Hmm.
good scholar would go to the literature and discover all these papers and realize that the paper was wrong because 20 years
Yeah.
later somebody published something that says it's wrong. But
Yeah.
what I worry about is a starting graduate student or somebody else looking this up and saying, oh, this was published in JAX and is a really good paper, this must be
Right.
right, and
Right.
then just
And must be the end of the story. Yeah.
never discovering that, yeah, the title is wrong and everything else about it is wrong, but the data
Yeah.
are right. So
Yeah.
anyway,
A way to stick with it. That's great. That's fantastic.
yeah, I mean, I'm glad I did, although I still feel kind of, I'm still sort of amazed that it escaped my radar for that long, that
Hey,
no
it
one
takes
ever
a
said,
village, right?
no
It
one ever
takes a
said, hey,
village.
Jeremy, have you seen this paper? It's like, but I'm sure it was like no one wanted, everybody assumed I knew about it and no one wanted to have the awkward conversation. Oh, I saw your thesis is entirely wrong. How does that feel? So,
That's right.
Well, it goes to show it's never too late.
That's right.
yeah, well, and I get to be the one correcting it, which is always better than having somebody else saying, hey, Berg's an idiot, so.
Joy, do you have a discovery of the week?
I do. The other evening I saw a movie. It's called Quartet, and it came out in 2012, and it was on Amazon Prime in the kind of BritBox. We like to watch a lot of, British films and things like that. And this movie was Dustin Hoffman's directorial debut. It was the
Hmm.
first film that he directed, as well as produced. Um, and it was just wonderful. It was about a retirement home for musicians in, must have been in somewhere in the Cotswolds, in this gorgeous
Right. Idyllic
manor.
landscape. Yeah.
Yeah. But this retirement home was all the most fabulous opera singers and musicians from kind of London back in the heyday. And um, they have interpersonal relationships, but they're all playing music, and they're rehearsing for a big show, which is kind of the pinnacle of it. But it was just such a good example of remembering that, if you do what you love and you can keep doing it as long as you can, um, that keeps you grounded, and can continue on, right?
Right. Keeps you connected with life.
Keeps you connected with life. And so it's Maggie Smith,
Mm.
and Billy Connolly is hilarious, and it's a great cast, and it's just a really great movie on every level. So I highly recommend it.
Cool.
Okay. I'll add it to my watch list. So mine is this week a book called Everything is Tuberculosis, by John Green. And it was a book I picked up just on a whim at the library. And it just is a reminder that we're all focused on autism and COVID and all these things, that every time I read about tuberculosis, you're reminded of A, it's a curable disease. B, its burden on worldwide health is huge and people forget about it. And in this environment, you worry all the more because it's a disease caused by malnutrition and overcrowding. And so, we have a political environment where there seems to be kind of a wanting to recreate Dickens' worst aspects of
Right.
life. And but it's a good reminder, reminder of all the social effects that diseases can have. Like Ringo Starr had tuberculosis when he was a
Yeah.
child, and why in photographs from the 19th to the 20th century, men's whiskers disappeared because there was a theory that hairy faces were causing the transmission of tuberculosis. So men had to start shaving. And all of those little things. It was just a fascinating book, not a great, great book, but it's a thin book. And so I'm a big, like, I just want nonfiction information fed to me, fast and furious. And so there's a little too much narrative for my liking, but it's a thin enough read you can skip around. But it's a really important reminder that there is a bigger disease world out there, and more complicated world than sometimes all these people with their obsessions want us to believe. So that was my
Well,
discovery.
that's something I will definitely take a look for. One of the things I did during COVID is my brother and I are the last of our clan,
Mm,
and our family history was pretty fragmented, and I decided that we better start writing stuff down or it was just going to go away completely. And that led to getting on 23andMe and Ancestry.com and trying to fill in all the gaps in my family history that I didn't know about, which turned out to be the ultimate rabbit hole. I mean, it was months worth
mm,
of very interesting, but lots of discoveries and lots of piecing things together. But my father's father um, was a complete enigma because he died 3 years before I was born of tuberculosis.
oh,
Hmm.
wow.
And so he was
Never
never really
around.
in the family very much. And he was also he and my father had a very contentious relationship.
Mm,
I think he was a pretty difficult man. Um, but when the course of discovering all this, my brother had a box of stuff from my mom that he'd never opened up, and he
Hmm.
sort of brought it down, and we went through it together. And I'm going through it, and about halfway down one of the boxes is my parents' wedding album,
oh, wow.
which no one had looked at, and my brother hadn't looked at it. And I discovered, these pictures and, their rehearsal dinner picture and various things.
Hmm.
And so my task was to try to figure out who all the people were. And there was one, not in that picture, but another picture. There was one man, who I couldn't figure out who it was, and I looked
Mm-hmm.
at him and I said, "I know who that has to be." And I
Mm,
think it's the only surviving picture of my grandfather because
wow.
Hmm.
I so yeah, no, TB. I mean, it had a huge effect.
Yeah. Yeah, I
My
didn't know
father,
Colorado Springs was actually, the whole city was founded as a retreat for tuberculosis patients.
my father grew up my father grew up in Astoria in Queens, and I
Mm,
think there were a lot of people who lived there who were
yeah.
came from crowded, poor
Hmm.
conditions, and
Yeah. And
it was a real problem. And once you got it back then. So
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Well, Jeremy, this has
All
been
right.
great. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our friends at Provoke the Truth for the music. And as always, let us know what you think. You can reach us at disruptedscience@gmail.com. And don't forget to go to your favorite book retailer and pre order How the
Yes.
Internet Disrupted Science.
See you later.